The train moved slowly through the quiet American night, its windows dim, its passengers half asleep, unaware that beneath the calm rhythm of steel on rails, they were passing through a place where history had quietly buried something it never intended to reveal. In the early decades of the 20th century, long before highways carved through the deserts and plains of the United States, trains were the silent lifelines of the country. They carried not just people and goods, but stories, thousands of them, moving steadily across states like Nevada, Utah, and California. Some of those stories were loud and proud, others were meant to disappear. Out in the Nevada desert, far from the growing cities and well beyond the reach of ordinary travelers, there existed a stretch of railway that few people spoke about. Official records showed nothing unusual, just another line connecting remote mining operations to the rest of the country. But the workers who had once been assigned there remembered something different. They remembered how the trains would sometimes arrive late at night, long after schedules had ended. No passengers would step off, no cargo was visibly unloaded, and yet the guards posted along the tracks were not the usual railway staff. They were quiet, disciplined, and carried themselves with a seriousness that suggested something far more official. One former worker, decades later, would describe those nights in a slow, thoughtful tone. He said the air itself felt heavier when those trains passed through, as if the desert, vast and open as it was, chose to hold its breath. The man had been young then, barely in his 20s, working maintenance along the tracks. His job was simple: inspect, repair, report. But even simple jobs have a way of leading people into places they were never meant to see. One evening, after a long and uneventful shift, he noticed something unusual. A train had been scheduled to pass earlier that afternoon, but it never arrived. That wasn't entirely uncommon. Delays happened, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert cooled, he heard it. A distant, low hum. Not the sharp, rhythmic clatter of a normal train. This sound was smoother, almost controlled. It grew slowly louder, cutting through the silence of the desert night like a quiet warning. Curious and perhaps a little too confident, he moved closer to the tracks. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The train that emerged from the darkness was unlike the others he had seen before. Its exterior was darker, almost blending into the night itself. The windows were either covered or simply not there. There was no visible numbering, no company markings, nothing that would identify its origin. And yet it moved with absolute precision. It slowed as it approached a section of track that, according to official maps, led nowhere significant. No station, no depot, just open land and distant hills. But as the train came to a stop, something unexpected happened. A section of the ground, barely noticeable in daylight, seemed to shift. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it clearly, the earth itself opening, revealing what looked like a hidden entrance built directly into the desert floor. There were no bright lights, no loud machinery. Everything moved quietly, efficiently, as if it had been practiced countless times before. The doors of the train opened. From where he stood, he couldn't see everything, but he could see enough to know that whatever was being moved that night was not ordinary cargo. Figures stepped out, dressed in uniforms he didn't recognize. They moved quickly, carrying sealed containers that reflected just enough light to reveal their metallic surfaces. There were no labels, no markings, nothing to suggest what was inside. The entire operation was conducted in near silence. No shouting, no unnecessary movement, just the soft sound of boots on gravel and the faint hum of machinery hidden beneath the ground. He should have left, Every instinct told him to walk away, to pretend he had seen nothing. But curiosity has a quiet way of holding people in place, even when they know better. He stayed, and that decision would change the way he understood history itself. As the last of the containers disappeared into the hidden structure, one of the figures paused. For a brief moment, the man turned his head just slightly, as if he had sensed something. Their eyes didn't meet, not exactly, but the worker felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being noticed. The train remained still for a few more minutes. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, it began to move again. The ground sealed itself behind it, leaving no visible trace of what had just occurred. By morning, the desert looked exactly as it always had, empty, silent, ordinary. When the worker reported what he had seen, the response was calm but firm. There were no records of such a train, no authorization for any activity in that area. He was advised, politely but clearly, to focus on his assigned duties and avoid unnecessary speculation. And so, like many others before him, he said nothing more. Years passed. The rail line was eventually decommissioned, replaced by modern routes and expanding highways. The workers moved on. The desert remained. But stories have a way of lingering, even when the places that created them are forgotten. Decades later, historians would begin to uncover fragments of information, small, seemingly unrelated details buried within government archives and personal journals, references to restricted transport routes, mentions of classified shipments during a time when the country was rapidly expanding its military and technological capabilities.
Nothing conclusive. Nothing that proved what the worker had seen, but enough to raise questions. Questions about what had been moved through those deserts under the cover of darkness. Questions about how many similar operations had taken place across the country, hidden in plain sight. And perhaps most quietly of all, questions about whether some parts of history were never meant to be fully understood. The desert, after all, is very good at keeping secrets. The years passed gently, almost unnoticed, as they often do in quiet parts of the American landscape. The rail line in Nevada slowly faded from memory, replaced by newer routes, smoother highways, and the steady hum of progress. Towns that once depended on the railroad adapted or disappeared. Workers who had spent their youth maintaining tracks and watching distant horizons grew older, their stories softening with time. But some memories never quite settled. The young worker, now an old man, had long since left the desert behind. He lived in a small town far from Nevada, where life moved at a slower, more predictable pace. Mornings were quiet, afternoons even quieter, and nights carried a calm stillness that many people found comforting. He rarely spoke about what he had seen, not because he had forgotten, but because the memory never quite fit into ordinary conversation. It wasn't something you could explain over coffee or bring up in casual company. It lingered in the background of his thoughts, like a distant sound you can't quite identify. Still, as he grew older, he began to notice something. Small things at first. A newspaper article mentioning classified rail shipments during wartime. A documentary briefly referencing hidden facilities in remote parts of the country. A passing comment from a historian about how certain operations were never fully documented. Individually, none of it meant much, but together they formed a quiet pattern, and patterns have a way of drawing attention. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across his living room, the old man sat with a stack of papers spread out before him. Clippings, notes, and copies of archived records he had slowly gathered over the years.
He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply wanted to understand. There were references to increased rail activity in the Nevada region during the 1940s, not unusual given the demands of the time. The United States was deeply involved in global conflict, and transportation networks were under constant pressure. But some entries stood out. Shipments listed without clear destinations, routes that appeared briefly in records only to disappear again, mentions of temporary facilities constructed and then removed with little explanation. Nothing definitive, just fragments. Yet the more he read, the more familiar it all felt, like pieces of a story he had already seen but never fully understood. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The memory returned, not sharply, but softly, like a dream revisited after many years. The quiet train, the hidden entrance, the silence of the men who moved without speaking. He had spent decades wondering if he had misinterpreted what he saw, whether time had changed the details, reshaped the moment into something it wasn't. But now he wasn't so sure. Across the country, similar stories had begun to surface. Not loudly, not in headlines or official reports, but in small, personal accounts. A retired engineer recalling a train that never appeared on schedules. A former military clerk mentioning documents that were sealed before they could be filed. A historian noting inconsistencies in transportation logs from the mid-20th century. Each story was incomplete, but they all shared a quiet resemblance. It was never enough to confirm anything, but it was enough to wonder. One particular document caught his attention. It was a copy of an internal memo dated decades earlier. The language was formal, precise, and carefully worded, as most official documents are. It referenced a temporary logistical transfer point located somewhere in the Nevada desert. No exact coordinates, no detailed description, just a brief mention that the site would be decommissioned upon completion of operations, and that all related records would be restricted under standard protocol. He read the line several times. Decommissioned. It was a simple word, but it carried a certain finality. If the site had been removed, as the document suggested, then there would be nothing left to find. No structure, no entrance, no visible trace of what had once existed. Just desert. Endless, quiet desert. And yet, something about that conclusion felt incomplete. Because while structures can be removed and records can be sealed, the land itself remains. And sometimes the land remembers. Weeks later, driven by a quiet curiosity he could no longer ignore, the old man made a decision. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, just a calm, steady choice. He would go back. The journey took time. The Nevada desert had not changed much in appearance, but the paths leading through it were different now. Roads had shifted, landmarks had faded. The precise location he remembered was difficult to find. But memory, even after many years, has a way of guiding people. He drove slowly, following instincts more than directions, until the landscape began to feel familiar in a way he couldn't quite explain. Wide open space, low, distant hills, a silence that felt deeper than ordinary quiet. He stopped the car and stepped out. The air was still. No wind, no movement, just the vast openness of the desert stretching in every direction. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. Not for anything specific, just listening. Of course, there was nothing to hear. No trains, no machinery, no hidden doors opening beneath the ground. Only the faint sound of his own breathing and the distant call of something far away. He walked a short distance, his steps slow and deliberate.
There were no visible signs of what he had once seen. No markings, no structural remains, nothing that would suggest any kind of human activity had ever taken place there. If someone had arrived without knowing the story, they would have seen only an empty landscape, peaceful, ordinary. And yet, as he stood there, he felt something familiar. Not fear, not even unease, just a quiet sense that this place had once held something important, something carefully hidden. He looked out across the desert, the sunlight now softer as the day moved toward evening. For a brief moment, he imagined the scene as it had been, the train emerging from the darkness, the ground opening silently, the figures moving with quiet precision. Then, just as gently, the image faded, replaced once again by stillness. He didn't stay long. There was nothing more to see, and perhaps nothing more to understand. Some stories, he realized, are not meant to be fully uncovered, not because they are impossible to find, but because they were never intended to be complete. As he returned to his car, the desert behind him remained unchanged, silent, endless, and patient, as if it had all the time in the world to keep its secrets. The drive back felt longer than the journey out, not because of distance, but because something in his mind had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The desert had offered no answers, no clear evidence, nothing he could point to and say, "This is what I saw." And yet the absence of proof did not feel like the end of the story. If anything, it felt like the beginning of a different kind of question. In the weeks that followed, the old man returned to his routine. Mornings with coffee, afternoons with quiet reading, evenings that faded gently into night. On the surface, everything remained the same, but beneath that calm, his thoughts had become more focused. He no longer questioned whether the event had happened. Instead, he began to wonder why. Why that location? Why such secrecy? And most of all, why move something in that way, under those conditions, with such careful silence? He revisited the documents he had collected over the years, this time with a different perspective. Instead of looking for confirmation, he looked for context. What was happening in the United States during the time he had worked on that rail line? The answer, of course, was complex. The mid-20th century had been a period of rapid change. Technological advancements were accelerating, military projects were expanding, entire programs were being developed in secrecy, often far from public view. Nevada, in particular, had become a place where certain activities could be conducted without drawing attention. Wide open land, sparse population, natural isolation. It was, in many ways, the perfect setting. He found references to testing grounds, research facilities, and temporary installations that appeared and disappeared over the years. Most of them were eventually acknowledged, at least in part, but not all. Some entries remained incomplete, some records ended abruptly, and some locations were mentioned only once, never to appear again. One evening, while reviewing a collection of archived transportation logs, he noticed something subtle but unusual, a pattern in the timing. Several shipments, spread across different months and even different years, all passed through a similar region of Nevada. The routes were not identical, but they shared a common intersection point, an area that, according to official maps, had no significant infrastructure. No station, no facility, nothing that would justify repeated logistical activity, unless, of course, something had existed there temporarily.
He traced the entries carefully, noting the dates, the frequencies, the gaps between them. The shipments were not constant. They appeared in intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months, as if whatever operation had taken place was not continuous, but scheduled, deliberate, controlled. He leaned back again, letting the information settle. A quiet realization began to form. What he had witnessed that night had not been a one-time event. It had been part of a system designed to move something important enough to require secrecy, precision, and isolation. But systems, no matter how well designed, rarely operate in complete silence forever. They leave traces, not obvious ones, but small, almost invisible signs that something once existed. He began to look for those signs, not in official records this time, but in personal accounts, letters, journals, recorded interviews, stories told quietly, often dismissed or forgotten. And slowly, patiently, he found them. A construction worker who had been assigned to a temporary project in the desert, only to be reassigned without explanation weeks later. A driver who recalled delivering supplies to a location that did not appear on any map. A technician who mentioned working underground, though he could not clearly describe where. Each account was incomplete, each one missing details, but together they formed something larger. Not a clear picture, but an outline, and within that outline, a possibility. The old man did not rush to conclusions. He understood the nature of memory, the way stories can change over time. He knew that not everything he read could be taken at face value. And he also understood something else. When enough separate accounts begin to align, even loosely, they begin to carry weight. They begin to suggest that something real once existed, something structured, something intentional. One night, as rain tapped softly against his window, he sat with all his notes spread out once more. The room was quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of water outside. He looked at the timeline he had created, the shipments,
The locations, the personal accounts. And then, almost without thinking, he drew a line. Not a straight line, but a connection. From the rail activity, to the temporary site, to the disappearance of records, to the silence that followed. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to understand the shape of the story. And sometimes, understanding the shape is all that remains. He folded the papers carefully, placing them back into their folder. There was a sense of calm in the act. Not satisfaction exactly, but acceptance. Whatever had been moved through that desert, whatever had been stored beneath its surface, had been part of a moment in history that was never meant to be fully revealed. And now, decades later, it remained just out of reach. Not hidden completely, but not fully visible either. Somewhere in between. Like the memory of a sound you can almost hear, but never quite catch. The old man turned off the light and sat for a moment in the darkness. Outside, the rain continued, steady and quiet. Inside, his thoughts slowed. He no longer felt the need to search further, not because the mystery had been solved, but because it had been understood in its own quiet way. The desert had kept its secret, and perhaps that was always the point. For a while, everything remained still. Days passed into weeks, and the quiet rhythm of life returned as it always does. The old man no longer spent his evenings searching through records or tracing patterns across fading documents. The folder he had carefully built over the years now rested untouched on a shelf, gathering a thin layer of dust. It might have ended there, a story remembered, partially understood, and then gently set aside. But history,
especially the kind that is never fully told, has a way of returning when it is least expected. It began with a letter. Not an official document, not something marked with authority or urgency, just a simple envelope, delivered among the usual mail, its presence unremarkable in every way, except for one detail. There was no return address. The old man noticed it immediately. He turned the envelope over in his hands, studying it with quiet curiosity. The paper felt ordinary. The handwriting, however, was careful, almost deliberate, as if the person who wrote it had taken their time. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just a short message. Some places are not meant to be remembered, but they are never truly gone. He read the line once, then again. There was no explanation, no additional detail, only a set of numbers written beneath the sentence. Coordinates. For a long moment, he simply sat there, the paper resting lightly in his hand. It could have been a coincidence, a mistake, something sent to the wrong address, but something felt intentional. He stood, walked quietly to his desk, and unfolded an old map. The coordinates were easy enough to check. With careful movements, he traced the numbers across the grid. The location they pointed to was not far from where he had been before. Not the exact same place, but close. Close enough to matter. He leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, though his thoughts had begun to shift once more. He had not spoken to anyone about his visit to the desert. He had shared no details, made no public inquiries. As far as he knew, there was no reason for anyone to contact him, especially not like this. And yet, the letter had found him, quietly, precisely. The room felt still again, the same calm atmosphere he had grown used to. But beneath that calm, something subtle had returned. Not urgency, not fear, just a quiet pull. The kind that doesn't demand action, but invites it. He folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. Hours passed. The daylight faded. Evening settled in, and still the thought remained. By the time night had fully arrived, the decision had already been made. The next morning, he prepared for the journey once again. There was no rush in his movements. He packed only what he needed, checked his vehicle, and set out with the same steady pace as before. The road stretched out ahead of him, familiar in some ways, different in others. The landscape shifted gradually as he moved farther from town, the signs of everyday life thinning until they disappeared entirely. The desert returned, wide, silent, unchanged. But this time, his destination was more precise. The coordinates guided him, leading him off the main path and onto a less traveled route. The ground became rougher, the terrain more uneven, until eventually he reached a point where the road could go no further. He stopped the car and stepped out. The air felt the same as before, still, quiet, almost weightless. He looked around, comparing what he saw to what he remembered. The area was similar, but not identical. The hills were arranged differently. The open space felt narrower somehow. He walked forward slowly, the paper with the coordinates folded in his pocket. There was no obvious marker, no sign that anything unusual had ever taken place there. Just sand, rock, and distance. But as he moved farther from the car, something caught his attention. A faint line in the ground. Not natural. Too straight. Too deliberate. He followed it carefully. It stretched across the desert floor, subtle enough to be missed by anyone looking closely. It wasn't a crack or a shadow. It was
something else. A seam. The realization came quietly, not with surprise, but with a kind of recognition. He had seen something like this before, years ago.
On a different night, in a different place, he stopped walking. The silence around him deepened, as if the desert itself had become aware of his presence. He waited. Nothing moved. Nothing changed, and yet the feeling remained. That same quiet sense that something existed just beneath the surface, not visible, not active, but not entirely gone either. He stood there for a long time, his eyes resting on the faint line in the ground. The sun shifted slowly overhead, the light changing as the day moved forward. Still, nothing happened. No sound, no movement, no hidden doors opening as they had before. Eventually, he took a step back, then another. There was no frustration in his expression, no disappointment, only understanding. Whatever had once operated in this place was no longer active. If it had ever returned, it was not doing so now. The letter had not led him to a discovery, it had led him to a reminder, a quiet confirmation that the story he had witnessed was part of something larger, something that extended beyond a single moment in time. He looked down once more at the seam in the earth. Then, without hesitation, he turned and began walking back toward his car. The desert remained still behind him, unchanged, unspoken, but no longer entirely unknown. The return journey felt quieter than before, not empty, but settled, like a thought that had finally found its place. The old man drove through the long stretches of desert road without distraction, the horizon steady, the sky wide and open above him. He didn't rush. There was nothing chasing him, nothing waiting ahead, just the quiet understanding that whatever he had been looking for was no longer something he needed to find. And yet, the letter remained, folded neatly, resting in his pocket. A simple message, a set of coordinates, no explanation, no name. When he arrived home, he placed the paper on his desk and sat down, studying it again under the soft light of the room. Some places are not meant to be remembered, but they are never truly gone. The words felt different now, less mysterious, more intentional, as if they had not been written to confuse, but to guide. He leaned back slightly, letting his thoughts settle. If someone had sent this letter, then someone knew, not just about the place, but about him. That realization didn't bring fear, it brought clarity, because it meant one thing: he had not been the only one watching. Days passed, quietly as they always did, but this time something subtle had changed in the way he moved through them. His attention had shifted, not outward toward records and history, but inward toward memory itself. He began to revisit that night again, not the surface details, not the train or the figures or the hidden entrance, but the smaller things, the things he had overlooked, the feeling of the air, the exact timing of events, the way everything had unfolded with such precision. Memory, when approached carefully, has a way of revealing what it once hid, and slowly, piece by piece, something began to stand out, a detail so small he had dismissed for years: the sound. He had always remembered the train being quiet, unusually quiet, but now, as he focused more closely, he realized something else. It hadn't just been quiet, it had been controlled. There had been no variation, no irregular rhythm, no mechanical inconsistency. Every movement, every shift in sound had been smooth, perfectly consistent, more consistent than any train he had ever worked with. He opened his eyes slowly. That kind of precision wasn't typical of the rail systems he had known, not at that time, not in that place, which meant the train itself might not have been ordinary, not just in appearance, but in function. He sat up slightly, his attention sharpening. If the transport system had been different, then what it carried might have required that difference, something sensitive, something that couldn't be moved through normal channels. The thought didn't arrive as a sudden realization. It arrived gently, as most truths do when they've waited long enough. This had never been about hiding something random. It had been about protecting something specific. That evening, as the sky outside turned a soft shade of gray, he returned once more to the folder on his shelf. He hadn't planned to open it again, but now it felt necessary. He laid the papers out carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, he wasn't looking for patterns in locations or timelines. He was looking for something else. Descriptions, technical details, anything that might hint at the nature of what had been transported. Most of the documents were vague, as he expected, but one entry, brief, almost overlooked, caught his attention. A reference to a contained material requiring stable conditions during transport. No further explanation, no classification, just that single line. He read it several times. Stable conditions. That would explain the precision, the controlled movement, the absence of noise and disruption. Whatever it was, it had required care, not just secrecy, but protection. He placed the paper down gently, and for the first time, a clearer picture began to form. Not complete, but clearer.
Hidden, not because it was dangerous in the moment, but because of what it might represent. The room felt quieter now, not in sound, but in understanding. He looked again at the letter, at the simple, steady handwriting, at the message that had brought him back to the desert. And then, almost without thinking, he turned the paper over. There, barely visible under the right angle of light, was something he had missed before. An impression, not ink, not written, pressed lightly into the paper, as if it had been beneath another sheet when something was written above it. He adjusted the angle slightly, letting the light catch it just right. Slowly, faintly, the shape became clearer. Letters, incomplete but readable. He leaned closer, careful, focused, and then, quietly, he saw it. A word, or part of one. Archive. He didn't move for a moment. The word lingered in his mind, connecting itself to everything he had seen, everything he had read, everything he had tried to understand. Not a storage facility, not a testing ground, an archive. The realization settled gently but firmly. Whatever had been moved through that desert, whatever had been hidden beneath its surface, it had not been something new. It had been something old, something worth keeping, something that for reasons unknown had been removed from the visible world and placed somewhere it would not be disturbed. He sat back slowly, the room unchanged, the night deepening outside. And for the first time, the mystery no longer felt like something distant or unreachable. It felt complete, not solved, but whole. Somewhere, at some point in history, something had been quietly preserved, moved through the darkness, stored beneath the earth, and then, just as quietly, left behind. Not forgotten, but set aside, as if waiting, not to be discovered, but to remain. The old man folded the letter one final time and placed it back into the folder. He did not search further. He did not return to the desert again, because now he understood something simple.
Not every part of history is meant to be uncovered. Some parts are meant to be kept, not hidden out of fear, but protected by silence. And sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that last the longest. For several days, the word stayed with him, archive. It wasn't a word that suggested danger in the usual sense. It didn't carry the urgency of weapons or the secrecy of active operations. Instead, it carried something quieter, something deliberate, preservation, care, intention. The old man moved through his routine as always, but his thoughts returned to that word again and again, turning it slowly, examining it from different angles. An archive of what? That question did not rush him. It settled gently, like everything else in this story. Because now, for the first time, he wasn't searching for something hidden. He was trying to understand something that had already been found long before him. One evening, as the light outside softened into dusk, he sat by the window with the folder open once more. But instead of focusing on the documents, he closed his eyes. Memory, he had learned, was not just about images. It was about feeling, about atmosphere, about the details that don't always appear in words. He returned slowly to that night in the desert, the train, the silence, the figures. But this time, he paid attention to something he had ignored before, the way those figures had moved. There had been no urgency, no tension, no sign of fear. They had not behaved like people handling something dangerous. They had behaved like people handling something important, something valuable, something that required respect more than caution. He opened his eyes. That difference mattered, because it changed the nature of the entire event. This had not been about hiding a threat. It had been about protecting something that already existed. The next piece came quietly, not from memory, but from a detail he had nearly overlooked in one of the older records. A brief mention, barely a sentence, referring to the transfer of historical materials requiring environmental stability. At the time, he had dismissed it as vague, possibly unrelated. But now, in the context of everything else, it felt different. Historical materials. Not equipment, not technology, materials. The word suggested objects, physical things, items that could be stored, preserved, archived. He leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. If something had been moved and stored beneath the desert, and if it had been described even briefly as historical, then the operation he had witnessed might not have been about the future at all. It might have been about the past. That realization did not come with excitement. It came with a quiet, steady weight. Because the past, especially in a country as vast and complex as the United States, holds more than just well-known events and documented history. It holds fragments, artifacts, records that never made it into public view, stories that were never fully told, and sometimes things that were never meant to be widely known.
He stood and walked slowly to the shelf where the folder had rested for so many years. But instead of reaching for it again, he paused. His gaze shifted to something else, an old photograph, framed simply, sitting beside a stack of books. It wasn't related to the desert, not directly. It showed a group of men standing near a rail line somewhere in the American West. The image was faded, its edges worn slightly with time. He picked it up, studied it. There was nothing unusual about it at first glance. Workers, tools, a stretch of track disappearing into the distance. But then his eyes moved to the background. Far behind the group, barely visible, was a structure, low, partially obscured, easy to miss. He had seen it before, not in person, but in feeling, in shape, in presence. Something about it echoed the memory of that hidden entrance in the desert. He sat down slowly, the photograph still in his hands. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, gently, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. What if the site he had seen had not been built for that specific operation? What if it had already existed, repurposed, reused, adapted for something new, something that required the same qualities: isolation, stability, silence? The idea settled into place. An underground structure, built at some point in the past, perhaps for mining, storage, or early infrastructure, later quietly transformed into something else, an archive not just of data or documents alone, but of physical history, objects, artifacts, possibly items considered too sensitive, too rare, or too significant to be placed in ordinary collections. He placed the photograph back down carefully. The room felt still again, but in a different way now. Not empty, not uncertain, but complete. The story had never been about a hidden experiment, or a mysterious cargo, or even the train itself. Those had simply been parts of a process. The real story had been something much quieter, something older. A decision made at some point in history to take certain pieces of the past and place them somewhere they would not be disturbed, not lost, not destroyed, just removed, held in silence. He thought again of the letter, of the coordinates, of the seam in the earth that marked something just beneath the surface. And then, for the first time, a different question appeared. Not what was stored there, but who decided it should be stored at all. Because archives do not create themselves, they are built, organized, chosen, which meant someone somewhere had decided what was important enough to keep and what could be left behind. The old man leaned back in his chair, his breathing slow, his thoughts steady. There was no need to search further. No need to return to the desert. The answers, or at least the shape of them, were already here, not in full detail, but in quiet understanding. Somewhere beneath the vast, silent landscape of the Nevada desert, something remained, not active, not visible, but present. An archive, hidden not out of fear, but out of intention. A collection of pieces of the past, carefully preserved beyond the reach of time and attention. And perhaps, most quietly of all, a reminder that history is not only what we are told, it is also what is chosen to be kept in silence. The old man closed his eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in calm, because the story, in its own quiet way, had reached its end, not with revelation, not with proof, but with understanding. And sometimes that is enough. Night settled gently over the town, the kind of quiet night where nothing feels urgent and even time seems to slow down. The old man sat in his chair, the room dimly lit, the soft hum of the outside world barely noticeable through the walls. The story, as far as he could tell, had reached its natural end. There were no more documents to read, no more places to visit, no more questions that needed answers, only a quiet understanding that something had existed, and still did, in its own way. He reached for the folder one last time, not to search, not to analyze, just to close it properly. Inside were the pieces he had gathered over the years, notes, records, memories, and now the letter. Each one incomplete on its own, but together forming something that felt whole. He placed the letter on top. For a brief moment, his hand rested there. Then he closed the folder, slowly, deliberately, as if sealing something that did not need to be opened again. The days that followed were calm. Nothing unusual happened, No more letters arrived, no unexpected details appeared. Life continued in its steady, predictable rhythm. Morning light through the window, afternoon silence, evenings that faded into stillness. And yet, something subtle had changed, not in the world around him, but in the way he saw it. Because now, when he thought about history, he no longer imagined it as a complete record of everything that had ever happened. He saw it differently, as something shaped, selected, organized not only by what was known, but by what was chosen to remain unknown. One evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of blue-gray, he stepped outside. The air was cool, the street quiet. He looked up for a moment, his eyes resting on the open sky above him, vast, uninterrupted, much like the desert he had once stood in. There was a certain comfort in that similarity, a quiet reminder that some places and some stories do not need to be understood in order to be real. He thought again briefly of the train, the smooth, controlled movement, the silent operation beneath the earth, the careful way everything had been handled. At the time, it felt mysterious, unexplainable. Now it felt purposeful, as its every detail had been part of something larger, something that extended far beyond a single night or a single location. He returned inside and sat down once more. The room was exactly as it had been. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt settled, complete. He no longer felt the quiet pull to search for more, no need to uncover, no need to confirm, because the story had never been about discovering a hidden truth. It had been about recognizing that some truths exist quietly, without needing to be revealed. The folder remained closed, undisturbed, a small, simple object resting on a shelf. But within it, a story remained, not written in full, not explained in detail, but present, in memory, in fragments, in understanding. And somewhere far away, beneath the vast silent expanse of the Nevada desert, the archive remained as well, unseen, untouched, holding whatever it had been chosen to hold, not waiting to be found, not meant to be opened, just existing, as it always had. The old man leaned back in his chair, his eyes slowly closing, the quiet of the room wrapped gently around him, and for the first time in many years, there was nothing left to wonder, no questions lingering at the edges of thought, no unfinished pieces, only calm. Outside, the night continued, steady and silent, and the story, like so many others in history, settled into that same quiet place, not lost, not forgotten, but softly held just beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, where some stories are meant to remain forever.
The tension that had once lingered at the edges was no longer content to remain there. It began to move closer, not all at once, but in quiet steps, until it could be felt in nearly every part of the kingdom. Reports arrived more frequently now, carried by messengers who traveled long distances, each one bringing pieces of a larger picture. Small conflicts, disagreements that had grown sharper, moments where words had given way to action. Nothing yet that could not be contained, but enough to show that the balance Catherine had worked so carefully to maintain was becoming harder to hold. Within the court, the atmosphere shifted again, less calm, more watchful. People listened more closely, spoke more carefully, as if every word might carry consequences. Catherine remained steady, but even she could sense that the time for quiet observation alone was beginning to pass.
There would still be patience, still understanding, but now those qualities would have to exist alongside something else. Resolve, the ability to act even when no choice felt entirely right. One evening, as the light faded slowly from the sky and the court settled into its usual silence, a message arrived, different from the others, not because of its length or the way it was written, but because of what it carried. News of a conflict, larger than those before it, more organized, more deliberate. A sign that the divisions within the country had crossed a threshold, that they were no longer simply growing, they were beginning to take shape. Catherine listened as the message was read, her expression unchanged, her posture calm. But within, there was no uncertainty left. This was the moment she had sensed for so long, the point where waiting would no longer be enough. Still, she did not react immediately. She allowed the silence to settle, allowed the weight of the news to be fully understood, because decisions made in haste could not be undone easily, and what came next would matter, not just for the present, but for everything that followed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, measured, not raised, not hurried. She called for careful response, for action that was firm but not reckless, for steps that would address the conflict without allowing it to spread further. It was not an easy path. There were those who pushed for stronger measures, for swift and decisive force. Others who urged caution, who feared that any action would only deepen the divide. Catherine stood between them, as she had so many times before, but now the space between those sides felt narrower, more fragile, and yet she did not step away. She held that position, balanced, focused, guided not by fear, but by the understanding she had built over years. Actions were taken, carefully planned, measured in their intent, and for a time they seemed to hold. The conflict did not disappear, but it did not immediately spread. A fragile pause, a moment where things remained contained, but Catherine knew that this was not an ending, it was only a beginning. Because once divisions reach this point, they rarely fade on their own. They continue, shifting, adapting, waiting for the next moment to rise again. And so she remained vigilant, watching, listening, preparing. The quiet strength that had defined her for so long was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a readiness, not for conflict, but for the reality of it, an understanding that peace was no longer something that could be assumed. It had to be protected, maintained, sometimes even defended. And though the road ahead was becoming more difficult, more uncertain, Catherine did not turn away. She continued forward, step by step, decision by decision, holding on to the balance for as long as she could, because she knew that even in times of division, even when the path seemed unclear, there was still value in patience, in understanding, in the quiet effort to hold things together. And as the night settled once more and the court grew still, there was a sense not of peace, but of pause, a brief moment between what had already begun and what was yet to come, a moment where the story seemed to rest just for a while before continuing into something deeper, something more challenging, something that would test everything Catherine had become. But for now, the silence returned, soft, uncertain, and waiting. The pause did not last. It never truly does. What had once been held at a distance, what had been carefully contained, began to move again. Not slowly this time, but with a quiet determination, as if everything that had been building beneath the surface had finally found its moment. Reports no longer came as isolated incidents. They arrived closer together, more urgent, more difficult to ignore. What had once been described as tension was now something more defined, something that could no longer be softened by careful words alone. Within the court, the atmosphere tightened. Conversations became shorter, more direct. There was less space for uncertainty, less room for delay. Catherine felt it in every moment, not as panic, but as pressure, a steady weight that rested just beneath everything she did. And yet, her composure did not break. It did not falter. If anything, it became more focused, more deliberate, because now, more than ever, she understood the cost of losing it. One decision, made without care, could undo years of balance, years of effort, years of quiet restraint. So she moved forward, not quickly, but firmly. There were choices now that could not be avoided, actions that had to be taken, not because they were desired, but because they were necessary, for stability, for control, for the hope, however fragile, that things could still be held together. Some measures were strengthened, authority made more visible, not as a display of force, but as a reminder that order still existed, that the structure of the kingdom had not yet been lost. At the same time, she continued to seek understanding, even when it became more difficult, even when voices around her grew sharper, more divided. Because she knew that without understanding, any action, no matter how strong, would only deepen the divide. Her son, no longer as young as he once had been, began to feel the weight of his position more clearly. The world around him, no longer something to simply learn about, but something to carry, to face. Catherine remained beside him, not shielding him from it, but guiding him through it, helping him see not just the surface of events, but the deeper patterns beneath them, because she understood that the future would belong to him, and he would need more than authority. He would need awareness, patience, the same quiet strength that had shaped her own path. Still, even with all her efforts, there were moments when it became clear that not everything could be controlled, that some forces, once set in motion, would move forward regardless of intention. And in those moments, Catherine did not resist reality. She did not deny it. Instead, she adjusted, adapting her approach, finding new ways to respond, to guide, to maintain what stability remained. Because control was never absolute. It was always a balance, a continuous effort to respond to change without being overtaken by it. The nights grew heavier now, not louder, not filled with chaos, but with thought, with the quiet understanding that each passing day brought new challenges, new decisions, new uncertainties. And yet, even in that weight, Catherine remained steady, because she had never relied on ease. She had never expected the path to be simple. Her strength had always come from something else, from the ability to continue, even when the way forward was unclear, even when the outcome could not be guaranteed. And so the story moved on, no longer just unfolding, but deepening, becoming more complex, more demanding, each moment building upon the last, leading towards something that could not yet be fully seen, but could be felt, clearly, inevitably, approaching. And at the center of it all, Catherine stood, not unchanged, but strengthened by everything that had come before, ready not for a single moment, but for whatever would follow, even if that meant facing the limits of what she could hold together, even if that meant watching the balance she had worked so hard to maintain begin to shift once again. But for now, she continued, as she always had, calm, focused, and moving forward, one quiet decision at a time.
The balance, so carefully maintained, began to slip. Not all at once, not in a single moment that could be pointed to and named, but in small fractures, barely visible at first, then slowly impossible to ignore. The conflicts that had once seemed distant had now spread, wider, closer, no longer confined within a few regions, but reaching across the kingdom, touching lives, disrupting the fragile sense of order that Catherine had worked so long to preserve. Reports came with increasing urgency, not just of disagreement, but of violence, of communities turning against one another, of fear replacing the quiet tension that had once defined these divisions. And within the court, there was no longer any illusion of calm. The atmosphere had changed completely. Voices were sharper, decisions more pressing. There was less time to consider, less space to wait. And yet, Catherine did not abandon her approach. She could not, because without it there would be nothing left to hold on to. Still, she knew that the moment had come where patience alone would not be enough. Stronger actions were required, not out of desire, but out of necessity, to prevent the kingdom from breaking apart entirely. And so, she began to make choices, more decisive than before, more visible. Actions that would once have seemed too firm now became unavoidable. For every decision, there were consequences, some immediate, others unfolding slowly in ways that could not be fully predicted. There were those who supported her, who believed that order had to be restored at any cost, and there were those who opposed her, who saw each action as a step too far, as something that would deepen the divide rather than heal it. Catherine listened, as she always had, but now listening was only part of what was required. She had to act, even knowing that no choice would satisfy everyone, that every path forward carried its own risks, its own uncertainties. Her son, now more aware than ever, stood within this shifting world, no longer shielded by distance or youth, but directly affected by every decision, every outcome. Catherine remained beside him, not as a protector from reality, but as a guide through it, helping him understand that leadership was not about certainty, but about responsibility, about making choices even when none of them felt right. The weight of it all grew heavier with each passing day, not just for her, but for the entire kingdom. And still, there were moments, brief, quiet, where the world seemed to pause, where the noise faded and only silence remained. In those moments, Catherine allowed herself to reflect, not on what had gone wrong, but on what still remained, what could still be held together, what could still be guided towards something better. Because even in the midst of conflict, even when the path seemed uncertain, there were always choices, always possibilities, however small, however fragile, and it was those that she focused on. Not the chaos, not the division, but the narrow space where something could still be preserved, still be shaped, still be guided towards something better. Even if that better future felt distant, even if it could not yet be clearly seen. The story had moved far from where it began, from quiet observation to careful balance, to this moment where everything felt uncertain, fragile, at risk of breaking. And yet, Catherine remained, not untouched by it, not unaffected, but unbroken. Because her strength had never come from control, it had come from endurance, from the ability to continue even as the world around her changed, even as the balance shifted, even as the outcome became harder to predict. And so, she moved forward, not with certainty, but with purpose, holding on to what she could, letting go of what she could not, and guiding the kingdom through one of its most difficult moments, as best as anyone could, as best as she could.
And though the future remained unclear, though the path ahead was filled with challenges, the story did not stop. It could not, because history, even in its most difficult moments, always continues, slowly, unfolding, one decision, one consequence, one quiet moment at a time. And somewhere in that unfolding, the next chapter was already beginning, waiting just beyond the present, ready to reveal itself.
The next chapter did not arrive with clarity. It came with confusion, with moments that did not seem to connect. Events unfolding in different places at different times, yet all part of the same growing storm. What had once been tension, what had slowly become conflict, was now something far more difficult to contain. It moved unpredictably, shifting from one region to another, rising suddenly, then quieting, only to rise again. There was no single center anymore, no single place where it could be addressed. It had spread into the fabric of the kingdom itself. And Catherine, standing at the center of it all, understood something clearly now. This was no longer about preventing conflict. That moment had passed. Now it was about navigating it, limiting it, guiding it, so that it would not consume everything. Within the court, the pressure had become constant. There were no longer quiet days, no longer moments of simple routine. Every hour carried weight. Every decision mattered. Advisors spoke more urgently, their voices no longer calm, but edged with concern, with insistence, each one offering a different path, a different solution, and yet none of them offered certainty, because there was none to offer. Catherine listened, still always listening, but now her responses came more quickly, not rushed, but decisive, because hesitation could no longer be afforded. There were moments when force was used, carefully, reluctantly, but used nonetheless, to restore order where it had broken, to prevent further spread, and each time it carried a cost she understood, even when others chose not to see it, because every action, no matter how necessary, left something behind, a memory, a consequence, a shift in how people saw the world, and those shifts added up, slowly shaping the future. Her son continued to grow into his role, but now his path was far from gentle. He was learning not just from observation, but from experience, from the reality of leadership in a time of division. Catherine remained close, but she allowed him to face it, to feel the weight of it, because shielding him now would only leave him unprepared for what lay ahead. Still, there were moments when even she could feel the strain, not outwardly, not in ways others could easily see, but within, in the quiet spaces where thought replaced action, where reflection replaced decision. There, the weight of everything she carried was fully present, and yet she did not allow it to overwhelm her. She had come too far for that, had endured too much, learned too much to falter now. Instead, she adjusted, as she always had, adapting to the changing world, finding new ways to respond, to guide, to hold on, even as the ground beneath her shifted, because that was the truth of it now. The ground was no longer steady. It moved, constantly, and survival, for the kingdom, for her family, for everything she had worked to protect, depended on the ability to move with it, without losing balance entirely. The story had become something different, no longer quiet, no longer gentle, but still not chaotic, not uncontrolled, because at its center there was still Catherine, still steady, still thinking, still guiding, even when the path ahead was obscured, even when the outcome remained uncertain. And though the challenges continued to grow, though each step forward felt heavier than the last, she did not stop,
could not stop, because this was no longer just her journey. It was the journey of an entire kingdom, moving through one of its most difficult times, searching for a way forward, even if that way had not yet fully revealed itself. And so, the story continued, not with resolution, not with clarity, but with movement, slow, steady, uncertain, and yet unstoppable, as all history is, carrying everything with it toward whatever would come next.
The movement could no longer be slowed. What had once been guided, carefully shaped, now began to push forward with a force of its own. Beyond control, beyond quiet influence, events unfolded faster, not in a rush that could be clearly seen, but in the way one moment no longer settled before the next one arrived. Catherine felt it, the narrowing of time, the shortening of distance between cause and consequence. There was less space now to reflect, less room to wait. And yet, she did not abandon herself to urgency. Even as the world around her began to move more quickly, she held on to her pace, because she knew if she allowed herself to be pulled into that speed, she would lose the one thing that had always guided her: clarity. The conflicts across the kingdom had reached a point where they could no longer be described as separate. They were connected now, feeding into one another, strengthening each other, creating a cycle that was difficult to break. And within that cycle, fear had begun to grow, not just among the people, but within the structures of power itself. Fear of losing control, fear of losing stability, fear of what might come next. Catherine recognized it immediately, because fear, more than anything else, had the power to destroy balance, to push people toward extremes, to turn uncertainty into action without thought. And that was something she could not allow. So, even as pressure increased, even as voices around her grew louder, more urgent, more insistent, she remained steady, grounded, refusing to let fear become the guiding force. Her decisions, though more frequent now, remained measured, each one considered, not just for its immediate effect, but for what it might lead to, because by now she understood fully that the future was shaped not by a single moment, but by the accumulation of many, and each of those moments mattered. Her son stood closer to that reality now, no longer observing from a distance, but living within it, feeling its weight, its complexity, its uncertainty. Catherine watched him carefully, not with doubt, but with awareness, knowing that his path would be even more difficult than her own, because he had not been given the years of quiet preparation that she had. And so she guided him more directly now, not just through example, but through words, through shared understanding, helping him see that strength did not come from force alone, but from control, from patience, from the ability to remain clear even when everything else became clouded. Still, even with all her efforts, there were moments that could not be shaped, events that unfolded beyond her reach, beyond anyone's reach.
And in those moments, the limits of control became clear. Not as failure, but as reality. A truth she accepted without resistance, because resisting it would only lead to greater loss. Instead, she adapted, again and again, finding ways to respond to what could not be prevented, to guide what could not be stopped, to preserve what could still be saved. The nights, once quiet and reflective, now carried a different feeling, not heavier, but sharper, filled with a clarity that came from knowing that each day ahead would demand more focus, more strength, more endurance. And yet, there was no hesitation, no retreat, because by now there was nowhere else to stand, no place outside the story. She was within it, at its center, and everything she had become, everything she had learned, was now being tested, not in a single moment, but continuously, relentlessly. And still, she remained, unshaken, not because the world was stable, but because she had learned how to stand even when it was not. The story continued to move forward, not toward resolution, not yet, but toward something inevitable, something that had been building since the very beginning, now closer than ever, now impossible to avoid. And as that moment approached, Catherine did not look away. She did not slow. She did not rush. She simply continued, steady, focused, prepared, to face whatever would come next, even if it changed everything, even if it tested the limits of all she had worked to hold together. Because this was the nature of history, not gentle, not predictable, but always moving, always unfolding, and always demanding more.
The moment that had long been approaching finally began to take form, not as a single event, but as a series of moments, each one connected, each one building upon the last, until it became clear that something irreversible was unfolding. The divisions that had once been argued, debated, carefully managed, were now breaking into the open, no longer contained by words, no longer softened by distance. They had become real, visible, unavoidable. Across the kingdom, conflict no longer appeared as scattered incidents. It had taken root, deep, spreading through cities, through communities, through lives that had once existed side by side, and now stood apart, facing one another, with uncertainty, with fear, sometimes with anger. Within the court, there was no longer any sense of normal rhythm. Everything had changed. The structure remained, the titles, the positions, but the feeling was different, tighter, more fragile, as if everything held together by threads that could break at any moment. Catherine saw it clearly. There was no illusion left, no sense that things could return to what they had been. That time had passed. Now the only question was what would come next, and how much could still be preserved. Her decisions became sharper, more immediate, not rushed, but no longer distant. She acted when needed, spoke when necessary, held silence when it served a purpose. Every choice intentional, because there was no longer room for uncertainty in action, even if uncertainty still remained in outcome. Her son, now standing fully within his role, faced the reality of power in its most difficult form, not as authority alone, but as responsibility, as consequence,
as the weight of decisions that affected not just a court, but an entire nation. Catherine remained near, but she no longer stood in front. She stood beside, allowing him to take his place, while still guiding, still supporting, still ensuring that he did not stand alone. Because even now, in the most uncertain of times, guidance mattered. Steadiness mattered. The presence of someone who understood, who had seen it all unfold, who could remain calm when everything else threatened not to be. Still, outside the walls of the court, events continued to escalate. Moments of conflict grew more intense, more difficult to contain. What had once been preventable now often was not, and each of those moments left a mark on the people, on the land, on the future that was slowly being shaped by everything that was happening now. Catherine knew that some of these things could not be undone, that history, once it reached this point, did not move backward, it moved forward, through consequence, through result, through the unfolding of everything that had been set in motion. And yet, even with that understanding, she did not give in to it. She did not allow inevitability to become inaction, because even within a path that could not be changed entirely, there were still choices, still moments where direction could be shaped, even slightly, even quietly, and those moments still mattered, perhaps more than ever. The nights grew quieter again, but not with peace, with anticipation, with the sense that something larger was just ahead, something that would define not just the present, but everything that followed. And in those quiet hours, Catherine remained as she had always been, thoughtful, composed, unmoving in the face of uncertainty, because she understood something that had guided her from the very beginning, that even in the most difficult times, even when the world seemed to shift beyond recognition, there was still value in remaining steady, in continuing forward without losing clarity, without losing purpose. The story had reached a point where it could no longer return to its earlier calm, where everything that followed would carry the weight of what was happening now. And still it moved, as it always does, without pause, without hesitation, carrying everyone within it toward what could not yet be fully seen, but could already be felt, clearly, inevitably, drawing closer with each passing moment. And in the center of it all, Catherine remained, not untouched, not unchanged, but unwavering, as the world around her prepared to enter one of its most defining chapters, a chapter that would test everything and leave nothing exactly as it had been before.
And then, the fragile line that had held for so long finally gave way. Not everywhere at once, not in a single unified moment, but in enough places, in enough lives, that it could no longer be denied. What had once been tension, what had slowly become conflict, was now something deeper, something that reached into the heart of the kingdom, changing it, shaping it in ways that could not be easily undone. The reports that arrived no longer carried uncertainty, they carried confirmation of clashes, of unrest, of moments where control had slipped and could not be quickly restored. Within the court, there was no longer any question of what they were facing, only how to endure it, how to respond to it, how to prevent it from becoming something even more destructive. Catherine stood within that reality, fully aware now that the balance she had held for so long had reached its limit. Not because she had failed, but because the forces around her had grown beyond what balance alone could contain. And still,
She did not abandon her principles. She did not turn to extremes. Even now, especially now, she held to what she understood, that once everything is lost to reaction, there is little left to rebuild from. So her actions remained measured, even as they became stronger, more visible, more necessary. She worked to stabilize where she could, to bring order where it was still possible, to prevent the spread where it had not yet reached. It was no longer about preserving peace, not in the way it once had been. Now it was about limiting damage, about protecting what remained, about ensuring that the future, however uncertain, would still have something to stand on. Her son, now fully within the weight of his crown, faced moments that no preparation could have fully prepared him for. Decisions that carried immediate consequence, actions that could not be undone. Catherine remained beside him, not to take his place, but to steady it, to ensure that even in uncertainty there was still thought, still clarity, still purpose. Because without those, power becomes something dangerous, something unstable, and she would not allow that, not if she could help it. Still, there were moments now when even her influence could not reach far enough. Events unfolded beyond the walls of the court, beyond the reach of immediate control, and each of those moments added to the weight of what was already happening. The kingdom, once held together by structure, by tradition, by shared understanding, now felt divided, not completely broken, but no longer whole. And yet, even in that division, life continued. People moved forward, adapted, endured, as they always have. And Catherine, seeing this, understood something that few others allowed themselves to consider, that even in times of great unrest, there is still continuity, still a thread that carries forward from one moment to the next, from one generation to the next, and that thread, no matter how strained, must be protected, must be guided, because it is the only thing that allows history to continue, to rebuild, to find its way forward again. The nights now held a different kind of silence, not reflective, not peaceful, but aware, as if everything, every wall, every quiet corridor understood that they stood within a moment that would be remembered, a moment that would shape everything that followed. And in that awareness, Catherine did not look for escape. She did not wish for the past. She remained where she was, fully present, fully engaged, because this was the moment she had been moving toward all along, not by choice, but by path, by time, by everything that had come before. And though the future remained uncertain, though the outcome could not yet be seen, she did not waver, because her role had never been to control everything. It had been to guide, to steady, to endure. And that she continued to do, even as the world around her changed beyond recognition, even as the story entered its most difficult chapter, one where resolution was not yet possible, one where every step forward would carry both loss and the possibility, however distant, of something new. And so the story moved on, through uncertainty, through conflict, through the quiet determination of those who refused to stop. And at its center, Catherine remained, not untouched, but unbroken, as history continued to unfold around her, one moment at a time.
The unfolding did not slow. If anything, it deepened. What had already begun now started to reveal its full weight.
not just in events, but in consequences. In the quiet aftermath of each decision, each conflict, each moment that could not be taken back. Across the kingdom, there was a growing realization that this was no longer temporary, no longer something that would simply pass with time. It had become part of the present, part of daily life, something people now had to live within, adapt to, endure. And within that reality, Catherine continued to move forward, not searching for a quick end because she knew there wasn't one, but searching for stability, however small, however fragile. Moments where order could still exist, where structure could still hold, even as everything else shifted. Her decisions now carried an even sharper edge, not because she had changed, but because the situation demanded it. There were times when compromise was no longer possible, when a clear direction had to be chosen, even if it came with cost. And each time she chose with the same care, the same awareness that had guided her from the beginning, but now with a deeper understanding of what those choices truly meant. Because by now she had seen enough to know that every action left something behind, something that would shape what came next. Her son stood stronger now, not untouched by what he had faced, but shaped by it. His understanding no longer formed by instruction alone, but by experience, by the reality of leadership in a world that no longer felt stable. Catherine saw the change in him, not sudden, but steady, and in that there was a quiet reassurance that even in uncertainty, growth continued, that even in difficulty, something was being built, something that would carry forward. Still, the conflicts did not fade. They continued, sometimes rising sharply, sometimes settling just enough to create the illusion of calm, but never fully disappearing. And with each rise, each return, the weight of it all grew heavier, not just for those in power, but for everyone, because the effects of it reached far beyond the court, into everyday lives, into places where decisions made from a distance became realities that could not be avoided. Catherine understood this, perhaps more clearly than anyone, because she had always looked beyond the immediate moment, beyond the walls of the court, into the broader picture, into the lives affected by every choice. And it was that understanding that continued to guide her, even now, when the path forward felt narrower than ever. There were nights when even the smallest sound seemed to carry meaning, when silence itself felt like part of the unfolding story, not empty, but filled with everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. In those moments, Catherine did not search for answers, not directly, because she knew that some answers could only be revealed over time. Instead, she focused on what could be done, what could still be guided, what could still be held together. Because even in the most uncertain times, there are always points of stability, however small, and it is those points that determine whether anything can endure at all. The story had moved far beyond its beginning, far beyond quiet observation, far beyond careful balance. It now existed within complexity, within challenge, within a constant state of change. And yet, at its core, something remained: the steady presence, the quiet determination, the refusal to give in to chaos, to fear, to the loss of clarity. Catherine still stood at that center, not controlling everything, but guiding what she could, holding on to what remained, and ensuring that even in the midst of uncertainty, the story did not lose its direction entirely. Because direction, even when imperfect, is what allows movement forward, and without it, there is only drift, only loss, only silence without meaning. But that was not what she allowed, not while she still stood, not while she could still act. And so the story continued, not toward an easy end, not toward immediate resolution, but forward, always forward, carrying with it everything that had been, everything that was, and everything that had yet to unfold, into a future, still uncertain, still forming, but no longer untouched by the weight of history itself.